and we are going to get started. So like I said, welcome to part 2 of Back to Basics Plan Writing. This is a course that we've set up just for those who maybe don't write plans all the time, or have never written a plan and just want to know a little bit more about the actual basics of plan writing. This is our second one. The first one we went through what information to collect from the farmers, and how to do it. And we have some forms on the website that we use as recommendations that can help with that information gathering. And so I have now, and hopefully everyone can see up the DCR website. And if you just type into Google Chrome, whatever, DCR nutrient management, it should bring you up to this web page. You'll be under here under the nutrient management section. And if you jump down here to this second tab here called Planner Resources, it'll open a bunch of boxes for you. And then here under the All Planners section, we have the first webinar listed. So we have Back to Basics, Part 1, Getting Started, as well as some of our old webinars. And then if you would hop down to the ag specific information, this Getting Started Writing Plans is where we house the forms that we talked about last week. And so now we're going to build on, well, maybe not build on it, maybe backtrack a tiny bit. So last week, May, feels like last week. Last meeting, we talked about what to get from the farmer, and that is really based on the DCR regs. So this meeting, we're going to go even more into the regs, which I know is just thrilling for everybody on a Thursday morning that's kind of rainy. So I hope everyone's had their coffee and is buckled in for a really exciting time. And so our regs here, when I talk about the regs that we base everything off of, this is the nutrient management training and certification regulations, what is required by the DCR for nutrient management plans. So on the Virginia Law website, which I'm going to go over with us all today, but they're also on our website, again, under this nutrient management portion. If you look here, we have our nutrient management training and certification regs. They're all up there. And this is kind of where we base everything out of. And I promise it will not be as boring as I just made it sound, but it really is the bread and butter of nutrient management planning. We talked about nutrient management plan content in the last meeting. That's really where all that information from the farmer that we got is built from. It's the actual plan content, what's required to be a nutrient management plan in Virginia. And that form that we have is built essentially off of this entire section of our regulations. You can see it, the plan identification, which is the information that we get from the farmer about what they, where they are, what have you. And also, I'm going to interject right now. If you have any questions at any time, please feel free to put them in the chat, wave your hand, just unmute yourself. I'd rather run this as a conversation than me talking about the regulations for the next, 45 minutes. If you don't have any, that's fine, but just don't be shy. This is here for you guys to help you understand more about what Virginia nutrient management is, and open dialogue is a big part of that. And so now we'll jump back into this. Just want to let you all know about that. So we have here our plan content, which is what we went through last time. But this time we're going to talk about required nutrient management plan procedures. And really what that is the back basis of what goes into creating those plans. So last meeting was what builds a plan, and we're going to take a step back and go, well, we need this in the plan, but why? If you ever have the, why are we doing this? Why is it in there? Where does this come from? That is generally the nutrient management plan procedures section of our regulations. And so the number one point of this is that a certified planner shall include, and anyone else who lives in the reg world here, shall is something that has to happen. That is actual requirement. A should, if you see that, is a recommendation, but a shall, that's a firm one. So we have nutrient management planner shall include in each plan nutrient recommendations for each field in the plan, which is a bit obvious, but at the same time, it's going to talk about what we mean by those recommendations. And so the nutrient applications are based off of N, P, and K. That is nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, always in that order. And we are really, for the main part, when the regs were originally written, we were focusing on nitrogen. Phosphorus came into play in 2005. I think 2006 is when they actually got into the regs. And potash is, while not an environmental detriment that we try and manage to protect Virginia's waters like nitrogen and phosphorus, potash is a macronutrient that is required for good yields in your crops. And so you make these recommendations considering fertilizers, manure, biosolids, whatever that farmer has in their wheelhouse, industrial waste, legumes in the crop rotation, crop residuals, and other things. So you're not just necessarily looking at what manure, fertilizer the farmer has, but what rotations did they do previously that might retain some nitrogen, or other, how well are they keeping their soil on their field and therefore their phosphorus, things like that. So we're not just really looking at what the farmer's actually spreading, but what can be retained from previous crops too. And that's really the main thrust of nutrient management. We're making these recommendations and we're looking at these different sources. And so then it'll start to drop down into specifics about nutrient application rates. And this is where we can get a lot of the specifics out of. We'll talk about in a little bit timing of application rates and how planners can make those in plans. So really, when I said this is where we get in the meat of nutrient management planning, this is where we're digging into. So we have our application rates here. And they're determined based on the crop needs that are found in the Virginia Nutrient Management Standards and Criteria, and also the Commercial Vegetable Recommendation Guide, 2005. There's a 2025 one out there as well, which would probably be a better source for that, but it's written into the regs that we use 2005. And so anyone who's been through the training, which I'm going to say 99% of you guys have, you should be fairly familiar with the standards and criteria. Again, they're also available here on the DCR website. That I personally like having an electronic copy, not as well as the hard copy. They both serve their purposes, but in the electronic copy, you can search very easily for what you're looking for, which can be a really giant help. So it's saying here that all of our application rates that we are going to base the plan off of are pulled from this document, and application rates start on page 60. And this is the nutrient needs portion of it. It starts with corn. I don't know if anyone's ringing any bells from training or plan writing, but basically this is where you look at the productivity group of that specific soil based on your crop. And then you'll see your nutrient needs being met here for your nitrogen and then your phosphorus and your potash as well. And it'll go through a majority of the crops in Virginia, standard row crops, grasses, pastures, and then we also have our turf and ornamental at the end of this section as well. So this is the big nutrient recommendation section. At some point during this series, we're kind of go through every section of the standards and criteria as well. This is going to be a really thorough deep dive into plan writing. So we'll get back to this, but whenever we say nutrient needs, these are the tables that we're referencing starting on page 60 in the standards and criteria. Get back to where I need to go. All right, so we're going to base it on those needs. And this is the biggest. This is what really all of nutrient management was kind of aiming for. we're looking to get the best yield for that crop, but we shall not exceed the needs of nitrogen in that crop rotation, of that specific crop, not even that rotation. If you put corn in your field and it's recommending based on your soil that you are putting, it needs 150 pounds of nitrogen, that is all. That is the do not pass go, do not collect $200. We only need 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That is, I always say in the training school, if you don't remember anything else, remember that we are applying to our nitrogen rate. So if that's regardless if it's commercial fertilizer, if it's a manure source, you're not going above that nitrogen need of that crop. Nitrogen is a highly mobile nutrient, and it can create the most issues in the water from human health perspectives and from environmental perspectives. It can create if a algal bloom is nitrogen based, you're obviously going to get more algae in the water than we really need. And also it can be a human health issue in creating oxygen deprivation, basically in the elderly, the immunocompromised, and small children. So we try and keep that out as much as possible. That was what our regs were originally written for. But then in 2005, phosphorus was becoming more of an issue. So phosphorus was always written as rates shall be applied to managed to minimize adverse water quality impacts. And so then we started to go a bit more in depth in December 31st, 2005 is when they added in the P index and how to manage phosphorus more consistently from there. So with phosphorus, even though it says shall be managed to minimize adverse water quality impacts, that's sounding like, you can apply phosphorus to your heart's desire. But then you'll jump down because it says sections 2C, 1 through 5 of this subsection. And so the first one is that applications from inorganic nutrient sources shall not exceed crop nutrient needs. If you're working with a commercial fertilizer, an inorganic nutrient, it's not on-farm generated manure really, or even just manure in general. You are not over applying that phosphorus, which makes sense. Really, if you're buying fertilizer, why pay more for a product that is not going to have any impact on your crop yield? So in an example, if you have a field that is medium plus, so we're looking here at needing 80 pounds of P2O5, then you would only need 80 pounds of P2O5 for your commercial fertilizer. You would not be applying over that rate for commercial fertilizers. They did write in here that there shall be some exceptions for commercial inorganic fertilizer. Oh my gosh, organic fertilizer, excuse me. So your biosolids, your manures, that they're not going to exceed 65% base saturation levels in Virginia. So what is 65% base saturation? We're not really going to, be going out there trying to figure that one out per se, but that's where the P index was developed. And so the P index will run, it's a risk analysis for how much phosphorus could potentially get from your field into the water. And the higher the levels of phosphorus are in your soil, the closer you are to water, the less buffers there are, that risk grows and grows. And so it's basically a scale from 0 to 100, and you do various amounts of inputs based on your crop rotation, based on your soils, based on distance to stream. And if you are falling below 100. That is basically under 65% base saturation. And you can apply phosphorus at a kind of metered rate. Once you get over that 100 in the phosphorus index, that would be over your 65% base saturation. And that would allow for no more phosphorus on that field, even from a manure or a biosolid perspective, until that field's level was brought down in their soil testing. So wherever possible, phosphorus applications from organic sources shall not exceed crop needs based on the soil test. But if that is not possible, because even if all of your soils come back as very high in phosphorus, that's not going to stop the cows from creating more manure. You're going to try and maximize those application rates to be controlled within our standards and criteria and the P index. So it lists down here that you can, it's just going more into the specifics on fields controlled by existing operations that receive phosphorus applications from liquid dairy, liquid swine, biosolids. We're limiting the amount of phosphorus applied. This is kind of more add-ons basing once they started getting the P index rolling, that you need to start running those applications on these fields. And then in here, it says a single phosphorus application may be recommended to address multiple crops in a crop rotation, as long as it's identified within that nutrient management plan. So this is what we refer to as phosphorus banking or P banking, in saying that so long as you're not going over your nitrogen application, you can put down as much phosphorus as the crop you need that's going in the field now, the crop you are doing next season, and so on and so forth. So if it's allowable and you want to put down chicken litter in the first year of that plan at the rate, to meet your corn needs, your bean needs, your following corn needs, as long as you're not going over that nitrogen rate, you can do that. And you'll see here that it doesn't explicitly mention organic versus inorganic per se. So if you are doing a commercial fertilizer field, and I've seen this frequently, if a wheat grain is going down in the fall and you want to do your phosphorus applications for the following double crop beans, that's doable. Especially the commercial fertilizer, you can apply that phosphate rate to whatever the corn grain needs and whatever the soybeans would need. So then you wouldn't need to be applying your P or your K even in the spring. Since your beans don't really need nitrogen, they're a legume, they're producing their own. You can do one application and cover that year. You can also do the same with organic manure. And then we're going to also recommend application rates for secondary nutrients. So your sulfur, your boron, your zinc, they're often listed in the soil test. While nutrient management plans, as written in Virginia, we don't necessarily have in our balance sheet, we list NPK. It's not NPK, SC, whatever have you. If the soil test comes back saying, and down in the coastal plains where I am, a lot of times you do see manganese deficiencies, which you can do through dolomite lime. A lot of times there can be boron deficiencies or zinc. If the lab is going to list it in that soil test, it's best to also recommend that application in the plan, either as a note or in the narrative. And we're going to talk more about notes and narratives in future trainings, but that would basically just be saying, Virginia Tech recommends that potentially foliarly you put on a pound of boron, or if you can get it in this source. A lot of times you're seeing sulfur deficiencies as well. Ammonium sulfate can help with that, but not necessarily always. So if there's a recommendation coming in from a lab for either a micronutrient or a secondary nutrient, we'd want to include that in our plan as well. So that was listing kind of how we're basing our recommendations for our N and our P, you'll note that there wasn't a whole lot about potash. We haven't found anything that potash impacts adversely yet. So while we're recommending that you not over apply your phosphate, it hasn't been of a concern yet. And oftentimes I actually see phosphate being under recommended, which is not necessarily beneficial to the yields, because while we are protecting Virginia's waters, we also want to do that while the farmer is growing the best crop that they physically can get out of that field. And a potash recommendation is very helpful in that as well. So even if you're writing for an organic farm, an organic manure source farm, and the manure only covers so much, say there is still a potash deficiency in that, I'd always recommend following up within the realm of reasons. If it's like 5 pounds short of P or K, you can still make the recommendation, but realistically, it's probably not going to happen. But if they are needing maybe 100 pounds of potash still in that field, I would definitely go and recommend that to the farmer, that if it's possible for them to get their hands on that, to apply to that field, just because it's going to help their yields immensely. All right, so we talked a lot of it about how we base our recommendations off of. Now we're going to look at how we get those yield determinations that are going to be the basis of our nutrient needs recommendations. So if you remember way back to the training, we did things based on values and crop yields. So you'd go through the Virginia Agriculture Land Use Evaluation System, values for short, which is a study done by Virginia Tech. I think it started in the late 60s, and they did, I think it was 69 to maybe the late 80s, early 90s, where they did over 400 case fields across Virginia in corn grain. And they looked at all the different soil series and what kind of yields were to be expected off of them. It was not for irrigated corn, which is why in the standards and criteria, there's a whole separate section for irrigated corn. But they did this study and got base yield standards, and then they did another update in the early 2000s, I believe, and things were running still pretty similar to what they have. Soils don't really change. Seed genetics have certainly in the years making corn, especially varieties, more tolerant to drought. But for the main part, that value system is what we base our nutrient management recommendations off of. So when I say you're getting 150 bushels of corn per acre off of that field, that's going to be based on the values system, looking at the various soil series that go into that specific field, and depending on how many different soils are in that field, either doing a weighted version of it. So if there is no soil series that is greater than, if anyone can remember what the next number is, put it in the chat box and you'll get an extra gold star from me. How much of the field has to be in one soil series for it to be considered predominant? Is it greater than 1/3? Greater than 2/3? Everyone's feeling shy. Well, it's greater than 2/3. If it's 67% or more of the field, you can use that single soil series to base your crop recommendations off of. If there's no soil series at 67% of that field, then you'd be using the weighted version of it, where you'd basically take maybe your 4 or 5 different soils, determine how much acreage by percent of that field is in that soil series, and you can adjust your yields from there. And so that is where you're going to be basing all this off of. Your soil productivity groups are consistent with the soil productivity information in the standards and criteria. So we're gonna zoom all the way back to the front here. And here is our soil productivity group. So this, as of probably 1996, I do not think it got updated in 2005 or 14, are all the soil series in Virginia. there have been some additions to soils as we get better at mapping or just renaming things. So SERSGO, which is what the Web Soil Series survey is, does have a few differentiation soil series than we have here, but for the main part, these are all the soil series listed in Virginia, and then their soil management group, which was how the value system was originally started, and then they further broke that out to soil productivity groupings in that management group based on specific crops, 1 being the best, 5 being the least, and you also have not suited. A lot of times for alfalfa and tall grasses in the coastal plains, you have some not suited grasses, not suited soils, or if it's particularly wet or dry, I guess the grasses, aren't going to do that well in it. So we have listed each of these different for the soil series, and if you have some fields that are a mix of good productivity and bad productivity, it's going to affect what that yield end goal is, and that yield is how we base our nutrient needs. So we can use values, and that's great for if it's a new field, if it's a new farmer, if they don't necessarily have any kind of records, not knowing what to go into this field. But we also have a caveat that the farmer's past experience with crop yields in a specific field may be used to make reasonable adjustments to expected yields. And it's preferred to use the farmer's yield because while values is a very good base standard, if they're a very conscientious farmer who is working the land responsibly, doing kind of best management practices, you can generally retain more moisture, retain more soil health, which can increase your yields. So if you want to, genuinely look at what that farmer's doing in the field, if they have those records, that is kind of the preferred method. Values is great, but it's a base start. Verifiable crop yields are utilized to determine this expected yield. So generally the average of the 3 highest yielding years taken from the past 5 years and grown in a specific field. That can be tricky to get because if you are looking at potentially a 3-year different rotation, say maybe you're doing a corn, beans, and sorghum rotation, it might take you 15 years to build up that corn yield record, which that is a chunk of time, but it's what we have right now. You can also appear in lieu of verifiable yields provided. If you don't want to wait that amount of time, you can potentially adjust the yield up 20% in a specific field. If, say, maybe they have 5-year, they've gone through maybe 2 or 3 rotations of it, so they don't have that highest 3 out of 5, but you're seeing the highest trend in general. If that's within 20%, of an increase of that yield, you can potentially adjust it that way before you hit this 3 out of 5 highest years. If they're doing a big rotation, if it's just corn on corn on corn on corn or beans on beans on beans, you can hit that 3 out of 5 much faster. So we have our 2 different ways that we can look at what we're actually going to base our NP and K recommendations off of. We can look at the values, or you can also look at crop yields. That's going to help us with our nitrogen. But how do we get our P and K? Well, we soil test, because phosphorus and potassium, they are not nearly as mobile as nitrogen in the soil. So you can take a soil test and get an idea of what we're looking at in that field. So representative soil analysis should be determined through standard soil sampling. Standard soil sampling would be, in our recommendations, looking at approximately 20 acres. That can be plus or minus, depending on how many different soil series are in that field. The field shape potentially. If you are out here in the coastal plains where it is very flat, you have many fields that might be 1 or 2 soil series. They're being managed similarly. You might be able to get away with bigger than 20 acres if you're out west where there are slopes and changing soils and the fields are much tinier. Perhaps maybe you only want to do 10 acres in a soil sample. The smaller the representative size of that soil sample, the more accurate it's going to be. And generally, if you are no-tilling a soil, you're going to look at 0 to 4 inches, so maybe that much of a soil sample. And when I say soil sample, that's how far you're going to put the probe in. If you're doing a tilled field, it would be 0 to 6 inches, so about that big. So we're not talking huge depths. That's basically where the rooting zone is for when those crops are germinating, when they're putting down their roots, when they need to get the most nutrients really going. And if you would stick your probe down maybe 8 inches or more, you're going to have less P and K, but that's not going to potentially be what the actual recommendation is needed. So you could potentially be over applying because you're getting down more into the subsoil and not the surface of the soil where the crop's actually going to be. There is a great section in the Virginia Tech Agronomy Guide, I believe it's chapter 6, on soil sampling techniques. I'm sure we'll make our way to the Agronomy Guide at some point, as well as the Nutrient Management Mid-Atlantic Handbook in our whirlwind tour of plan writing. But if you do want to brush up on that, there is a great section in there from the Virginia Tech Lab themselves. So soil sampling, recommending about 20 acres plus or minus depending on how you're managing those fields, and 4 inches for no-till, 6 inches for till. Don't really go jamming probes down 12 inches unless you're doing soil samples for pre-side dress nitrate testing. Then you are going a foot down because that is where the roots are at that time. But that is a completely different topic for a different time. All right. So then we're going to also, if you if you're working on a farm that has manure applications, you want a soil test, and then you also want a manure analysis. Right now, we have, for our soil testing side, I believe there are 13 or 14 approved labs. They're also, again, on our website here, our approved soil testing lab list. You go there, it'll bring that up. And those are labs that either run the analysis in Mehlich 1 or Mehlich 3. Those are the two that we can accept in Virginia. Virginia Tech is a Mehlich 1 lab, and those are basically just how the methods that they use to extract the phosphorus and potassium out of the soil analysis. We can also do Mehlich 3 labs because you can convert Mehlich 3 to Mehlich 1. And we have this list of approved labs knowing that they do this in Mehlich 1 or Mehlich 3, and then also how they report them in parts per million, pounds per acre to P2O5. There's all kinds of different conversions back and forth between those to make sure we're actually coming to the right recommendation based on that soil fertility. So if you go to a lab that's not on our approved list and you try and then put it either into Nutman or the module, you might not be knowing what form of, is it Mehlich 1? Is it Mehlich 3? Could it be Bray, which we cannot do because that is a entirely different analysis version. And even if it is Mehlich 1 or Mehlich 3, is it in parts per million? Is it in pounds per acre? We need to make sure we're working off of the right conversion. So if you see a lab from a farmer that is not on this list, please do contact me. It's not a stagnant list. I recently just added a lab in this past month when the newsletter came out. And all we need to do is I just need to talk to the lab manager to make sure that they know that we're a Mehlich 1 or a Mehlich 3, and then we'll come up with these conversion rates so that we know our phosphorus and potassium conversions are working properly, as well as our line procedures. We used to only be able to do SMP and Mehlich 1 recommendations, but we are currently working on getting Adams and Evans single buffer method put in so that when you do a lab recommendation in the module for Adams and Evan, it will actually give you a accurate reflection of what should be put on that field. It's very exciting times we live in. So please do, if you find a lab not on this list that can run Mehlich 1 or 3, let me know and I will get in contact with that lab and add them to the list. We don't really have an approved manure analysis lab. The DCR uses Clemson. We've had an agreement with them for ages. Other labs are acceptable as long as we get results that have total nitrogen or TKN. I can never remember how to pronounce the K, so I'm just going to call it TKN. Ammonium nitrogen, total phosphate, total potassium, and the percentage of moisture. As long as the lab runs those results, we can use them. And we need the ammonium nitrogen. A lot of labs will only do the TKN, but for our plant available nitrogen calculations and for our residuals, we need that ammonium nitrogen, otherwise we can't calculate PAN. So yep, you can use one of those laboratories. If they use them, we don't really have an approved list, but make sure before the farmer sends an analysis out. We recently did just have someone send it to North Carolina Ag Department, and it didn't run the ammonium nitrogen, so we couldn't use that result. Just check on that before you run it, but otherwise you can use any old lab. And the last portion of this section is that we're going to expect the nitrogen contributions from legumes or previous manure applications to be included in the plan as well. So not only are we looking at, what kind of crop is being put into the soil for that specific yield, but we're going to look backwards to see if that previous crop or previous manure application is bringing along nitrogen as well, because that credit is going to then reduce what our actual nitrogen application is. So in the grand scheme of making the applications, we have your crop, which gives you the basis for kind of what we're looking at. Then you look at your soil test to see what your P and your K is. Your manure analysis will tell you what's coming in from your manure to make those applications based on the values or the crop yield that the producer has. And then you're also going to subtract your legumes from that as well. Is everyone with me so far? I know this is kind of really basic stuff, but a lot of times this nitty-gritties are forgotten as to why we're actually doing this and where a lot of this comes from. So this is where we're basing it all off of. If you don't have any questions on, application rates, then we're going to jump into timing. And this is pretty crucial too, especially for nitrogen. We have a really big section in the training school, if anyone can remember or tries not to block out that portion, because it does get overwhelming when we start talking about the 30, 60, 90 days. And that's mainly the 60 and the 90 are looking at organic sources of manure. So we're going to time recommendations for nutrient sources containing nitrogen, be it commercial, be it organic, to be as close to the plant nutrient uptake as reasonably possible. Strict, but wiggle room. And so we're looking at this, and basically it's going down here. We don't want to have nitrogen leaching or running off or even volatilizing and not becoming, or just going into the atmosphere and not being available for when our crops need it. So if you're putting down a commercial version of nitrogen 30 days before planting, that's going to be when it is the most available, before it can potentially leach, before it can run off, what have you. Ideally, that is every crop, but every nutrient source, but sometimes Manure happens and you got to work with it when you have it. With organic sources here, there may be differing times than specified up in Part A with your 90 days or 30 days before planting. So if you have to, you can fall into some of these other categories that are going to be mentioned below for organic sources only, not commercial, not inorganic. If you're buying it from, Nutrien or Meharin or whatever your commercial or, Valley Fertilizer, what have you, you're at 30 days. The rest does not apply. But if you have organic sources, applications of organic nutrient sources shall be within 60 days of planting a spring seeded crop to that site that are not environmentally sensitive. Oh boy, what's environmentally sensitive? So environmentally sensitive soils, again, here are listed in the standards and criteria. They are soils that have a high, and I apologize for the mad scrolling. There's nothing that drives me crazier than that. But once you get through all this values information, we'll jump into here in this environmentally sensitive. And so soils with a high potential for leaching based on soil texture, shallow soils that are less than 41 inches deep, which are over limestone or bedrock, anything that has subsurface drainage, so any tile drainage put in there. Soils with high potential for subsurface lateral, floodplains, and lands with greater than 15% slope. You don't have any of that, then it's not environmentally sensitive. 5 out of 6 of those are found in the soil survey and will be thrown a warning for you when you're writing a plan saying this is an environmentally sensitive field. But the soil survey will not have tile drainage information in there. That is something that you would get from the farmer, or you would get by looking at a field and saying, yeah, that is a drained soil. Mostly when you see tile drainage that is broken, that's not how you know it's there. But otherwise, that's something that you would only know if the farmer tells you. So if you don't have any of those situations, then 60 days of planting, 60 days before planting, you can put your manure down if you're not in an environmentally sensitive field. And that's any manure, liquid or dry. We can get into 90 days before planting a spring seeded crop. So that is, say you're putting in April 1st, we'll go with our coastal plains planting of corn. That could be, March, February, that could be January application, 90 days before. But there's a lot more caveats to this one. It can't be environmentally sensitive. It can't have a slope over 7%. It has to have 60% crop residue or cover crop on it. The application and any associated tillage is meeting with a conservation plan, and it has to be semi-solid beef or dairy manure with bedding in it, dewatered digested sewage that has bedding in it, or something that is more of a solid material. You can't really put a liquid because it's probably going to be on frozen ground for the most part. And so if you have any of those situations with manure, that's solid and you need to spread it out in January before the spring planting, you can get away with it. But, due caution is needed. Right. So then it's going to talk a little bit more about actual timing of nitrogen applications. So in general, it's best, especially if you are doing inorganic nitrogen and you have the ability to split that out. And for the most part, I would say 80% of the farmers that I've ever worked with are doing multiple splits, and that's more than just one of nitrogen. But if you are working with it there, based on our regs, you don't have to split your nitrogen unless it's environmentally sensitive, but we tend to recommend splitting it as a good planning practice. And a lot of cost share programs are working for that too. And I think I just way jumped ahead of myself on that one. I did. So we're going to backtrack a little bit. And still talk here about our 90 days. So that sites that are not environmentally sensitive, you can also put manure on them in the winter as a trap cropping situation. If your wheat has grown to stage 23 or more of the Zadex growth stage, which is also listed here in our standards and criteria. It's way back in the wheat section. If we want to jump back here, went past it. Here's where it talks about our growth stage. So we went back. I apologize. I got sidetracked by splitting nitrogen. But right now we're talking about putting manure still on fields in the winter. If you're going to put it on a trap crop, which is essentially putting cover crop out in the fall and then putting manure on it, you want to be about here in your tiller. So that's between 20 and 29. And you're just counting the tilling stages of the wheat that it's got beyond germination. You're in between your winter dormancy where tillering has begun, but it hasn't quite taken off because you don't want it to get your crop too far into it and then die out in the winter months. So in our regs, it's saying here that if you have, not an environmentally sensitive site, and I clicked the wrong button, then you can put out your manure on those fields. And the trap crop should be allowed to grow the entire site until 2 weeks of the spring planting to get that uptake of nitrogen. And then all nitrogen applications of organic nutrient sources to the trap crop, say that twice, shall not exceed obviously what the crop needs. And then also in the fall, when you go to put that down, it has to be less than 30 pounds of nitrogen coming from that from that manure source. So if you have your manure analysis, when you go to do it, you want to make sure that it's not more than 30 pounds going on that initial application. The next section is environmentally sensitive sites as identified in the standards and criteria. Can only get a trap crop application 60 days of planting. And I know this is where it gets really complicated regarding that 30, 60, 90, which were great questions to ask for the exam. So if you are working with a farmer who has a manure application, sorry, I saw someone at the chat. If you are working with a farmer that wants to do manure applications in the fall, you really want to jump into this section before you start making those recommendations, just so that you know this 30-pound caveat and this 60 days before if it is an environmentally sensitive site that you couldn't do it the 90 days or even in that fall, which would be almost 6 months before planting. You want to know the ins and the outs of each of those specific fields, just so you're making recommendations that are going to be within our regs and, the most beneficial to the farmer and the environment. There's also a section in here for composted organic nutrient sources. A little information on them, that if someone is composting, we're looking at what is considered composting would be a 20:1 C to N carbon and nitrogen ratio of it. If you are getting a composted material source, hopefully the lab will give you that C to N rating. And they are exempted from all that previous stuff if they have a greater than 20:1, just because they are going to be taken up at a slower rate. That nitrogen is not as readily available as it still breaks down. So if you are doing composted, you can be exempt from the above recommendations. So that's really not even a semi-solid or a dry. You're kind of going one step further into that. Here's where I got sidetracked. It was part E. This is the part where it actually starts talking about the split applications. I jumped ahead of myself. I hadn't quite finished out my 30, 60, 90. It's basically recommending that inorganic fertilizers are split as starter or broadcast if it's on an environmentally sensitive field. And then the use of PSNTs on manure can help determine the nitrogen needs during the growing period. So if you're doing commercial fertilizer on an environmentally sensitive field, you're going to be recommending that split nitrogen where you put some of it, a smaller amount on as a starter or banding, and then you come and you side dress the heavier amount of nitrogen during the actual 12 to 24 inch growth period of the corn. This is for environmentally sensitive sites specified. If it's not environmentally sensitive, you don't have to. However, it's still recommended as a good practice. And then if you are using an organic source, putting your manure on and then doing a PSNT during that 12 to 24 growth stage to see how much nitrogen was taken up during that period, which can vary depending on how wet or dry it is, how much of a good year we're having. And then somewhere in the plan, we generally have it in the narrative, a statement including the applications of inorganic nitrogen, nutrient sources, liquid manures, liquid sewage, sludge, liquid industrial waste do not occur on frozen or snow-covered ground. So if you put out manure and happens to get colder the next week, the ground freezes, that's fine. You didn't put it actively on the frozen ground. But if we have a snowfall, we have a winter like we did last year, where it's heavier, you actually have, consistently frozen ground. We're not applying that to those frozen grounds. However, if you have a frozen ground situation with dry or semi-solids, you can apply it in emergency situations, but that slope cannot be greater than 6%. You have to have that residue on that field at 60% with 3 inches or more of growth if it's a small grain or fescue, and then 200 feet of vegetated or crop residue between any surface water. So that's kind of an emergency situation where you need to get it out there. You can, but it is not recommended. You have to follow some pretty strict needs. And then to close out, because we are getting towards the end of time, application methods for nutrients. So this is basically looking at nitrogen materials shall be managed to minimize leaching and volatilizing. So that really follows, splitting that application. And applications of liquid manures or sludges using irrigation shall not be applied at hydrologic rates above those in the standards. So if you do have irrigation happening all the way back here in the manure section, we do list our hydrologic max wastewater irrigation rates, page 116. And that's basically not overwatering that field in particular. Plans shall not recommend liquid manure or sludge rates over 14,000 gallons per acre per application. If you want to split that application, say you really, need to do that, you can maybe do 7,000 early spring, 7,000 early summer, if that's possible. But in one application, you want to stay under that 14,000. But to allow for drying time in between those. Where possible, if you're doing a biosolid industrial waste or manure that can be incorporated or injected, we're going to recommend that. However, that will change the rate at what your plant available nitrogen is. So while we do recommend incorporation or injection, that might decrease how much manure you can apply on the field. So do be aware of that as a planner as well. That has gotten some people in the past. And the planner shall recommend, and again, this is usually in the narrative, which we will probably talk about at our next meeting, going to recommend setbacks around wells, springs, and surface water, just to, make the farmer very aware what those setbacks are. And they are listed in the standards and criteria, or if it is a VPA plan, they can also be attached to that particular permit. And our very last section here, manure production and utilization. The planner is going to estimate the annual manure quantity produced on the farm. So that's where getting accurate numbers from the farmer on animals is pretty, not just animals, but animal weight is also pretty needed. And then you're gonna you shall state the total amount of manure produced and then what can be used on the farm. It's not going to be perfect. There's either going to be an over or under application throughout the year. Just that's the way manure works. But you're going to have that estimate in there, and you want to know what you're working with, so you're not caught off guard and either have not enough manure to put on the fields or too much. And the last section is about plan maintenance and revision. So you're going to generally, when you're working with plans in general, it's 3 years. Manure plans, it's definitely 3 years. If you're doing a situation that's in constant grass, it can potentially be 5-year plan, but you're going to be updating those plans every 3 to 5 years, essentially. If you have a farmer who increases the animal numbers significantly above the level stated in the plan, and that's maybe not going from 99 cows to 100, but if they go from 99 cows to even 105, 110, that's going to change how much manure is created. If the weights change, if you get additional manure imported onto the farm from either biosolids or chicken litter, if land either decreases or increases, you're going to modify that plan mid-season. So you might only be a year into that plan, but something has significantly changed where you want to look back and re-recommend things because there is either going to be too much manure, not enough manure. That plan needs shifted around. Adjustments to manure production and applications. If there is an animal number change or how it's stored, you want to adjust that as well. And then down in here is where we recommend that soil tests be taken once every 3 years. You can do that more often. Some farmers do, they like to do it yearly. You don't necessarily need to do that. It can be a big undertaking, but the more recent the soil test, the more accurate the plan is going to be. Manure applications, we recommend once every 3 years, once there is manure to be established. This is just us if it's not a permitted plan. If it is a permitted plan, there will be ones written in there that they have to be taken every 3 years for dry and once every year for liquid. As part of that permitting too. And then modified top dressing or side dressing application rates are going to adjust based on the PSNT. So you're never going to recommend more nutrient application than what the crop needs, but depending on how much nitrogen was actually taken up by the crop, you might end up adjusting that split, that side dressing recommendation, to either be less than what you recommended or the max rate of what you recommended. If the nitrogen was particularly available, they might end up having to put on less. And that is 11 right on the dot. I know this was probably one of the least exciting webinars out there because we were just talking about regs, but really this is the meat, the bread and the butter of what a nutrient management plan is. And from here, we talked about how to get this information from the farmer. We talked about what's going to actually be needed in the plan. And so for our next couple of, the rest of the series, however long it goes, we're just going to start chipping away through the standards and criteria and through the actual plan writing process. I thank you all for your time. Again, if possible, if you can use the chat box, put your certification number there so you can get the 1 CEU for this class. This will be posted again on the website. I'm going to stop recording this now because this is just kind of outro stuff. This will be